Wonderful. So let's see if the slides can start. I don't know who directs that, but I'll wait until they come. I just want to maybe move into the session, which is a very important session, as we look at the shift of behind the scenes of how we create the societal fibers of our cities and the interrelationship with the Anthropocene, which actually you brought up so nicely. And I'm hearing from all of you one element that is so important, and that is the systemic element. How do we translate systems? Obviously, coming from the Club of Rome, 50-year anniversary of the Limits to Growth, systems is the essence of the thinking of the Club of Rome. Shifting from the Limits to Growth, which already actually 50 years ago was talking about this element of time and the fact that the alarm bells were ringing as population growth was growing, extractive societies were actually really taking the planetary boundaries to the very essence and the very limit of what was possible for humanity to thrive, not just survive, as we see today. A point which I think is very important as we look at the findings of the Club of Rome over the last 50 years, and in particular, the great systems thinking of Donella Meadows, is that we must find leverage points within systems in order to truly shift those systems. And that is where we are today, trying to understand the connectivity between the social system, the economic system, the global commons, and the political system in the midst of chaos, in the midst of what I call the 3 Cs, climate change, COVID crisis, and conflict, which is on our doorstep. How do we actually do that when we know that the impacts from growth and overconsumption are on our doorstep? The population growth and shift in demographics, which we must take into consideration, not to mention the shift within our urban cities as a reflection of COVID. The fact that the core limiting factor of human well-being is the way in which we've put so much stress on our natural resources and our environmental sinks. The fact that we need to look at more than 50% of the urban fabric, as you so clearly indicated, is expected to still exist by 2050. And the element of even more stress of new construction. That the world's richest 1%, and we haven't yet talked about inequality, is creating a real social tension, which, by the way, could be the greatest tipping point beyond the environmental tipping points. Climate change and the social tensions that will come from climate change, the conflicts, the migration, and of course the dependency on the earth, which is shifting very clearly due to access to water, to food, and to our bare essentials. And of course, the way in which our species, because we are part of a broader species, not just the human species, are actually being decimated by the ego, which has taken over in terms of the role of the human species on the planet. What we need to see is our material footprint. How do we thrive within urban centers if we don't take into consideration our consumption patterns and the shift within our consumption patterns? The needs that we have, which need to very much change. The way in which we look at demand, not just supply. And the way in which we very much look at the wealthiest who are putting the greatest pressure on the planet. That fair consumption space. We need to have a guiding framework where we look at overconsumption as the past. Making the future smell good again, John, is actually understanding our relationship with consumption. Coming back to the basics, coming back to the essentials that we actually have learned through COVID, that we do not actually need half of the material stuff that we have. That what is most essential is the way in which we interact with our social system. The fact that our families can thrive and survive when they are hit with systematic and very, very important and impactful crises. Because our global well-being is declining. And within our urban structures, but also within our rural structures, which are totally disenfranchised, by the way, from our urban structures, we are seeing this complete disconnect between those that continue to be the wealthiest and the overall well-being of the population. That is why, actually, last year we created the System Change Compass, a compass which originally was devised for the European Union Green Deal in working with President von der Leyen, which really looked back at the essence of the core principles that we need to integrate into our policy making and the way in which human beings interact with the societal fiber. The fact that we need to redefine prosperity, but go all the way through in terms of putting in place the right metrics to measure what that actually means, all the way to new governance models and new leadership models. This is very important also in terms of the way in which we look at our ecosystems, and in particular, our industrial ecosystem. The way in which each of those different ecosystems are driven, coming back to value-based decision-making, in particular from business models, but also from political signals and investment signals that drive those shifts. I won't go into each of these individually, but I would like to bring your attention to the disruption that we now have on our doorstep. This very important reminder that our unholy dependencies on certain materials, on certain types of resources, not only fossil energy, but industrial agriculture, certain metals and materials, are being completely shaken to the core, both as a reaction from COVID, when we saw disruption throughout the value chains, but also when we look at the disruption now with Ukraine. And who is feeling the crunch? It is people, because the prices of food and materials and energy are going up. So that inequality factor, once again, becomes fundamental. We therefore need to look at systemic solutions that it can really address these pressing socioeconomic needs and address the restructuring of the global economy and the way in which we address consumption, looking at the way in which we can address our energy and food dependencies, our material dependencies, to come into redundancy, to shift towards service alignment rather than just production alignment, to address also coming back to sufficiency and the importance of efficiency. That is why, and John has been part of our discussions, we set up the 21st Century Transformational Economics Commission. And working with our system dynamic modelers, building on the tradition of the limits to growth, have assessed how can we actually find the real turnarounds that are going to enable us to stay within the planetary boundaries. And we've come up with 5. Poverty being absolutely essential. Empowerment of women in particular, in order to ensure that they have access to education and they can be the drivers of the new economy that we need today. Inequity, not only between the North and the South, but within countries. And the relationship with energy and food, which are the basic essentials for our survival as we move forward. Within that context, we are looking at new economic models, and we have them. We have the well-being governments that have already put in place well-being economics, and by the way, through the crisis, have done much better economically. But we also have donut economics. All of these different economic models that are placing social well-being and environmental well-being at the heart of any political decision-making process. The Earth for All model looks, therefore, at the interrelationship, and I love the analysis that we've just seen across all the different discussions, the link to anatomy, the link to forestry, the fact that actually everything is interrelated. We go from the roots to the trunk, to the canopy, to the link to the gods. This actual continuum of the system dynamic is so important. And we've tried to address in the same way that interrelationship between poverty, equality, empowerment, food, and energy, and all of the different leverage points that we need in order to truly shift our society. These are the 5 global turnarounds that are the most needed. Ending poverty, addressing gross inequality, accelerating gender equity, transforming the food system, and transitioning to clean energy. The turnarounds we have seen can truly achieve a beyond GDP perspective, which brings us back to true well-being. Well-being that I would say shifts us from a consumption model fully dependent on natural resources use back to us being within nature, in harmony with nature, and nurturing the garden of the future that not only smells good, but actually makes us survive and thrive in the 21st century. This is the decisive decade. There is no time for complacency nor despair. We have shifted from the limits to growth, and we are now moving into Earth for All. Thank you very much.